She thought she was running toward help, but she was about to awaken something far more dangerous than fear. The rain hit the pavement in uneven rhythms, cold and relentless, soaking through the thin fabric of Zoe Hayes' shirt as her small sneakers slapped against the sidewalk, each step uneven, desperate, her breath catching between sobs she couldn't control as she darted between parked cars and flickering streetlights, her voice breaking into the empty night. "Please, somebody help my mama." But the doors she passed stayed closed, the windows dark, the world around her choosing silence over involvement until she saw them. Black SUVs lined along the curb, engines humming low like something alive, and men in dark suits standing still in a way that didn't belong to ordinary people. And at the center of them, stepping out slowly as if the night itself waited for him, was Adrian Volkov, his coat untouched by the rain, his presence cutting through the chaos with a stillness that made everything else feel distant, controlled, untouchable. And Zoe didn't hesitate. She ran straight toward him, her tiny hand colliding with his coat, gripping it like it was the last thing holding her above water. As she looked up, eyes wide and trembling, "They're hurting my mama." The men around Adrian shifted, subtle but alert, their attention sharpening. But Adrian didn't move, not at first. His gaze lowered slowly, meeting the girl's face, taking in the tear-streaked cheeks, the shaking shoulders, the raw panic that couldn't be rehearsed. And for a moment, something unreadable flickered across his expression before it disappeared behind the same calm that had built empires and ended conversations without a single raised voice. "Who is hurting her?" he asked, his tone quiet, measured, but it carried weight, the kind that made even the rain seem to hesitate. And Zoe swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around his coat. "Upstairs they won't stop." Her voice cracked on the last word, and somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, a woman's cry echoed through the damp air, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to exist, just enough to be heard by someone who was willing to listen. And Adrian's jaw tightened ever so slightly, his eyes shifting past Zoe toward the old apartment building across the street, its windows dim, its walls worn, the kind of place people learn not to look too closely at, because seeing meant responsibility, and responsibility was inconvenient. One of his men stepped forward, voice low, "Boss, this isn't," but Adrian raised a hand, silencing him without even looking, his focus still on the building, still on the sound that most people had already decided to ignore. And then Zoe did something no one else in that moment could have done. She didn't beg louder. She didn't cry harder. She simply held on, her small hand refusing to let go, as if somewhere deep inside she believed that this man, this stranger, would be different, and that belief, fragile as it was, landed heavier than any demand ever could. Adrian exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried memory with it. Something old, something buried, something that had once sounded just like this. And when he finally moved, it wasn't rushed, it wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate, controlled, inevitable. Like a decision that had already been made long before this night ever began. He stepped forward, the men around him instantly falling into motion without needing instruction, the air shifting with them, the balance of the street tilting in a way no one could quite explain, and Zoe stumbled slightly as she followed, still holding his coat, still not letting go, as if letting go meant going back to a world where no one answered when she called. And Adrian didn't stop her. He didn't pull away. He simply walked toward the building, toward the sound, toward something that was no longer just happening in the shadows. And as the door opened under his hand, the night behind them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what kind of man answered child's cry. The hallway smelled like damp carpet and something forgotten, the kind of place where time moves slower and people stopped asking questions long ago. And as Adrian stepped inside, the sound followed him more clearly now, not loud, not chaotic, but persistent, like a signal that refused to disappear. And Zoe's grip tightened again as her small feet struggled to keep pace beside him, her breathing uneven but quieter now, as if being close to him had shifted something inside her, even if she could not explain why. And behind them, the men in dark suits moved with quiet precision, spreading out without a word, their presence filling the narrow space without making noise, like shadows that had learned discipline, and Adrian did not look back. His attention fixed upward toward the stairwell, where a flickering light buzzed overhead, casting brief flashes of yellow against cracked paint and worn railings. "Which floor?" he asked, his voice calm, steady, and Zoe swallowed, pointing upward with a trembling hand. "Second, door on the left." Her voice barely above a whisper now, and Adrian nodded once, as if confirming something already decided, before he began to climb, each step measured, unhurried, but carrying a weight that made the building feel smaller with every second. And somewhere above, the sound shifted again, quieter now, almost as if whoever was inside had sensed something changing, something approaching, something they could not yet see. And when Adrian reached the landing, he paused for the first time, not out of hesitation, but out of control, his head tilting slightly as he listened, truly listened. And for a brief moment, the world narrowed to that. Single door, worn wood, chipped edges, a weak light glowing beneath it. And Zoe's voice broke again, softer this time. "That is her." And Adrian looked down at her just for a second, his eyes steady, unreadable, but there was something else there now, something quieter, something that had not been present outside in the rain. And then he turned back toward the door, his hand reaching out, not to force it, not to break it, but simply to open it. And when it moved inward with a low creak, the room inside fell still in a way that did not belong to coincidence. Conversations stopping mid-breath, movement freezing without command, because the kind of presence that entered did not need volume to be understood. And Adrian stepped in, not aggressively, not loudly, but with a certainty that shifted the air itself, his gaze sweeping the room once, taking in every detail without urgency, every face, every posture, every trace of tension that had been left behind in the space. And then his eyes found her, Monique Hayes, standing near the far wall, her shoulders drawn tight, her expression caught between fear and disbelief, as if she could not yet process what had just changed. And Zoe slipped past Adrian before anyone could react, running straight to her mother, wrapping her arms around her waist, burying her face against her. "Mama," and Monique froze for a second before her. Hands came down around her daughter, holding her close, her breath unsteady, her voice barely forming words. "Zoe, baby, what are you doing here?" But Zoe only held on tighter, as if answering would break something fragile. And across the room, no one spoke, not because they were told not to, but because something in Adrian's presence had already made the decision for them. And he stood there, silent, composed, his eyes no longer moving, fixed now on the ones who had filled the room with tension just moments before, and he did not raise his voice, he did not step forward again, he simply existed there, and that was enough to change everything. And in that silence, heavier than any argument, the balance of power shifted without a single word being forced, and Adrian finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying through the room like a quiet verdict. "She is not alone anymore." The words did not echo, yet they settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the air itself had chosen a side, and it was not theirs. And Adrian remained where he stood, his posture relaxed but unyielding, his presence filling the space in a way that made resistance feel smaller, quieter, unnecessary. And the men who had occupied the room just minutes before shifted subtly, their confidence dissolving not into fear of action, but into something deeper, something instinctive, the recognition of a line they had already crossed without knowing who would be waiting on the other side. And Adrian's gaze rested on them without urgency, without anger, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "You will step outside," he said, his tone even, almost polite, but it carried the kind of finality that did not invite negotiation. And for a second, one of them opened his mouth as if to respond, to challenge, to reclaim something that had already slipped away. But the words never came, because in that same instant, Adrian's men shifted behind him, not aggressively, not threatening, simply present. And that was enough, the balance already decided, and one by one, the men turned, moving toward the door in silence, their steps slower than before, their shoulders tighter, as if the room itself had become too small to hold what had just entered it. And when the last of them passed through the doorway, Adrian did not watch them leave. He did not need to. His attention had already shifted, drawn back to the quieter center of the room, where Zoe still clung to her mother, her small fingers gripping fabric like it might disappear if she loosened her hold. And Monique Hayes stood there, her arms wrapped around her daughter, her breathing uneven as she tried to steady herself, her eyes lifting cautiously toward Adrian, searching his face for something she could recognize, something she could understand, but what she found was not what she expected, not cruelty, not indifference, but something far more unsettling, restraint, and Adrian took a single step closer, not enough to invade her space, just enough to be heard without raising his voice. "Are you hurt?" he asked, the question simple, direct, and Monique hesitated, not because she did not understand, but because she did not know how to answer a man like him, a man who did not belong in places like this, a man whose presence rewrote the rules she had spent her life surviving under. And after a moment, she shook her head slightly, her voice quiet. I am okay," though the words carried doubt, exhaustion, and something else, disbelief that anyone had asked at all, and Adrian studied her for a brief second, not questioning, not pressing, just seeing, and then he nodded once, as if that was enough for now, as if her answer had been accepted whether it was complete or not, and he turned slightly, his attention shifting to the doorway where his men had already positioned themselves. The hallway beyond now silent, emptied of tension, but not of consequence. And when he spoke again, it was not to Monique, not to Zoe, but to the men who understood him without explanation. "No one returns here," he said, and there was no emphasis, no raised tone, just certainty and a quiet acknowledgement passed between them, a response without words. And behind him, Zoe slowly lifted her head, her eyes still wet, but no longer searching, no longer running. And she looked at Adrian the way only a child could, without calculation, without fear of what he represented, only with the simple recognition of what he had done. And Adrian felt it, that gaze, that unfiltered trust, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted beneath the surface, something older than power, older than control, something that did not belong to the man he had become, but to the boy he once was, standing in a different room, hearing a different voice, wishing someone had walked through that door. And he exhaled slowly, the memory passing as quickly as it came, but not without leaving its mark. And when he looked back at them, his voice was softer, though no less certain. "You are coming with us," he said, not as an order, not as a demand, but as a decision already made. And Monique hesitated again, her arms tightening slightly around Zoe, her instincts pulling her in two directions at once. Fear of the unknown and the quiet understanding that staying was no longer an option. And Adrian did not rush her, did not explain. He simply waited. And in that silence, the choice became clear, not because it was easy, but because it was the only one that did not lead back to the same door. Closing again, and slowly, Monique nodded, her voice barely audible. "Okay." And Adrian turned toward the hallway, his coat shifting with the movement, his steps already set, and behind him, mother and daughter followed, leaving behind a room that no longer held them. And as they stepped into the corridor, the building seemed to exhale, as if something had been lifted from it, something it had carried for far too long. The rain had softened to a quiet drizzle by the time they stepped back outside, but the street no longer felt the same, the air heavier, as if it remembered what had just passed through it, and Adrian moved toward the waiting vehicles without hesitation, his pace steady, unhurried, while Monique followed a few steps behind, her arm wrapped protectively around Zoe, who now walked in silence, her small hand no longer shaking, but still holding tightly to her mother's side. And the men opened the rear door of the black SUV without a word, their movements precise, practiced, and Monique paused at the edge of the curb, her eyes lifting to the vehicle, then to Adrian, uncertainty flickering across her face as reality caught up with her. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying both caution and exhaustion. and Adrian stopped, turning just enough to face her, his expression unchanged, but his tone deliberate. "Somewhere safe," he said, and the simplicity of the answer did not explain anything. Yet it did not need to, because there was something in the way he said it that made the word safe feel different, heavier, more certain than anything she had heard in a long time, and Monique hesitated for one last second, her instincts pulling against her. Years of surviving on her own, telling her not to trust what she could not see, but Zoe shifted beside her, looking up with quiet insistence. Not fear, not doubt, just trust. And that was enough. Monique nodded slightly and guided her daughter into the vehicle, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound that seemed to separate them from the street entirely. And as Adrian entered from the opposite side, the interior lights dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the city filtering through tinted glass. And for a moment, no one spoke, the hum of the engine steady beneath them as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, the building shrinking behind them, its windows returning to darkness as if nothing had ever happened, and Zoe leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, her eyes growing heavy, the adrenaline that had carried her through the night finally beginning to fade, and Monique wrapped an arm around her, her hand brushing gently through her daughter's hair, a quiet reassurance that did not need words. While across from them, Adrian watched in silence, his gaze not intrusive, not cold, simply observant, as if he were taking in something unfamiliar, something he did not often allow himself to see. And after a few minutes, Monique's voice broke the quiet, softer now, steadier. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, the question simple, but layered with everything she had learned about the world, everything that told her nothing came without a reason, and Adrian did not answer immediately, his eyes shifting briefly to the window, the city lights passing in, slow reflections across the glass, before he looked back at her. "Because someone should," he said, and there was no elaboration, no justification, just a statement that stood on its own. And Monique studied him, searching again for something beneath the surface, some sign of motive, of expectation, but there was nothing there except control, and something else she could not quite name. And she nodded slowly, not because she fully understood, but because she recognized the truth in the absence of explanation, and the vehicle turned onto a quieter road, the buildings growing taller, cleaner, the streets more orderly, until finally it slowed in front of a gated property, the iron gates already opening before they reached them, responding without question. And as they passed through, the world outside seemed to fall away, replaced by a stillness that felt intentional, protected. And when the SUV came to a stop beneath a covered entrance, the door opened again, and one of the men stepped forward, offering a respectful nod. "Everything is ready," he said, and Adrian stepped out first, then turned slightly toward the interior, his gaze settling on Zoe, who had drifted halfway to sleep, her small hand still clutching her mother's sleeve, and for a brief moment, Adrian paused, watching her, as if measuring something he had not expected to carry into this night. And then he spoke, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. "You are safe here," and as Monique stepped out, guiding Zoe gently with her, she felt it, not just the words, but the space itself, the absence of tension, the absence of fear, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe it might be true, even if only for tonight. The house was quiet in a way that did not feel empty, but protected, as if every wall had been built not just to stand, but to keep something out. And as Monique stepped inside, her eyes moved slowly across the space, taking in polished floors, soft lighting, and the absence of chaos, the absence of tension that had once been a constant in her life. And Zoe stirred gently in her arms, her small body heavy with sleep, her fingers still curled into her mother's sleeve, as if even in rest she needed to be sure this was real. And Adrian walked ahead of them without looking back, his presence guiding rather than commanding, leading them down a hallway where the air carried a faint scent of clean linen and something warm, something unfamiliar to Monique, something that did not belong to survival, but to comfort. And when he stopped in an open doorway, he stepped aside, giving space rather than taking it. "You can stay." "Here," he said, his voice even, and Monique looked inside to find a room already prepared, a bed neatly made, soft blankets folded at the corner, a small lamp casting a gentle glow. And for a moment she did not move, not because she did not want to enter, but because she was not used to being offered something without having to earn it first. And Zoe shifted again, letting out a quiet breath. And that was enough to break the hesitation. Monique stepped inside, laying her daughter carefully onto the bed, her movements slow, careful, as if she feared the moment might disappear if she moved too quickly. And Zoe settled almost instantly, her breathing evening out, her face softening in a way that made her look younger, more like the child she was meant to be. And Monique stood there for a second longer, watching her, her hand brushing lightly over her daughter's hair, grounding herself in the reality that they were no longer in that apartment, no longer surrounded by uncertainty and when. She turned back toward the doorway. Adrian was still there, not inside, not intruding, simply present, his posture unchanged, but his gaze quieter now, less guarded. And Monique took a step toward him, her voice low, almost hesitant. "I do not understand this," she admitted, not as a challenge, but as a truth she could not hide. And Adrian nodded slightly, as if he had expected that, as if confusion was the most honest response to what had happened. "You do not have to," he replied, his tone steady. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar, as if it carried something that had not yet found words. And then Monique's eyes shifted, noticing details she had not before. The way the hallway remained still, the absence of noise, the quiet coordination of the people who had brought them here, everything operating without chaos, without raised voices, without fear. And it unsettled her in a different way, because it meant this was not temporary, not accidental. It meant this was how his world functioned. And she looked back at him, a new question forming. "What happens now?" she asked, and Adrian's gaze held hers for a second longer than before, not invasive, not cold, but deliberate, as if weighing the answer, as if choosing it carefully. "Now," he said slowly, "you rest." And the simplicity of it almost caught her off guard, because rest had never been something given. It had always been something stolen in small moments between responsibilities, between survival. And she nodded, though the words still felt unfamiliar to her mind. And Adrian turned slightly, his attention shifting away, signaling the conversation was over without dismissing it. And as he stepped back into the hallway, he paused for just a fraction of a second, his eyes drifting once more toward the room where Zoe slept, and something in his expression softened again, almost imperceptibly, before it disappeared behind the control he carried so naturally. And then he continued walking, his footsteps quiet, measured, leaving behind a space that no longer felt like a place people were sent, but a place they were allowed to stay. And inside the room, Monique sat slowly at the edge of the bed, her hand still resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder, her breathing beginning to steady for the first time that night. And she closed her eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in disbelief, because somewhere between the rain, the street, and the door that had opened, everything had changed, and she had not yet decided whether to be afraid of that, or grateful for it. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped quietly through the tall windows in thin lines of soft light, touching the edges of the room before reaching the bed where Zoe still slept, her breathing steady, her small face peaceful in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after a night like that. And Monique had not moved far, still sitting at the edge of the mattress, her back resting lightly against the headboard, her eyes open but distant, as if sleep had come and gone without permission, leaving her suspended somewhere between exhaustion and alertness. And for a moment she simply watched her daughter, counting each breath without realizing it, grounding herself in something real, something she could hold on to, because everything else still felt uncertain, still felt like it could disappear if she questioned it too much. And the quiet of the room pressed gently around her, not heavy, not suffocating, just present. And she let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders lowering slightly as the tension that had followed her for years began, slowly, reluctantly, to loosen its grip. And then there was a soft knock at the door, Not loud, not demanding, just enough to be heard, and Monique straightened instinctively, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, her eyes moving to the door as it opened just a few inches, revealing a woman in a simple uniform. Her expression calm, respectful. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice carrying no curiosity, no judgment, just professionalism. "There is breakfast. Prepared downstairs whenever you are ready." And Monique blinked, the normalcy of the sentence catching her off guard. Breakfast, as if this were an ordinary place, an ordinary morning, and she nodded slowly, her voice soft. "Thank you." And the woman gave a small nod in return before closing the door gently, leaving the room just as quiet as before, and Monique looked back at Zoe, her fingers brushing lightly across her daughter's arm. "Zoe," she whispered, careful, gentle, and Zoe stirred. Her eyes fluttering open slowly, confusion flickering across her face for just a second before memory settled in, and she sat up quickly, looking around, her small voice still thick with sleep. "Mama, where are we?" And Monique hesitated, just for a moment, searching for the right words, but none of them seemed to fit, so she answered simply, honestly, "Somewhere safe." And Zoe studied her face, as if measuring the truth in those words. And then she nodded, accepting it without needing more. Because for her, safety was not a place, it was a feeling, and right now, she felt it, and that was enough. And as Zoe slipped out of bed, her bare feet touching the floor carefully, almost cautiously, she looked toward the window, the light catching in her eyes. "It is quiet," she said softly, and Monique followed her gaze, realizing she was right. There were no raised voices, no tension in the air, no need to listen for what might happen next. And that absence felt louder than anything she hadn't known before. And as they stepped out into the hallway together, the house seemed to respond without sound. The space opening ahead of them, clean, ordered, intentional. And when they reached the bottom of the stairs, Monique paused, her hand resting lightly on the railing as she took in the scene before her. A large dining area set with simple, elegant dishes, sunlight pouring in through wide windows. And at the far end, Adrian stood near the table, not seated, not distracted, simply there, as if he'd been waiting without needing to show it. And when he noticed them, he did not call out, did not gesture, he only turned slightly, acknowledging their presence with a small, almost imperceptible nod. And Zoe hesitated for a second, her hand tightening around her mother's. But then she took a step forward, her curiosity beginning to rise above her fear, and Monique followed, her posture still cautious, still uncertain, but no longer frozen. And as they approached, Adrian's gaze shifted briefly to Zoe, softer for just a fraction of a second before returning to its usual calm. And he spoke, his voice low, steady. "Did you sleep?" And Zoe nodded quickly, her voice small but clear, "Yes." And Adrian gave a slight nod in return, as if that answer mattered more than anything else in that moment. And Monique watched the exchange. Carefully, something in it unfamiliar, something that did not fit the image she had built of him. And as she stood there, she realized that whatever this place was, whatever this man was, it was not what she had expected. And that uncertainty for the first time did not feel like danger. It felt like something else entirely, something she had not yet learned how to name. The table was already set before they arrived, not in a way that felt staged, but in a way that suggested anticipation without pressure. Plates arranged neatly, glasses filled halfway, the quiet clink of silverware the only sound as Zoe stepped closer, her eyes scanning everything with cautious curiosity, as if she were stepping into a place she had only ever imagined but never expected to touch. And Monique remained just half a step behind her, her posture still guarded, her instincts not yet ready to rest completely, even if the environment around her offered no immediate reason to stay tense. And Adrian stood at the head of the table, not seated, not imposing, simply present, his gaze shifting between them with a calm that felt intentional, as if he were measuring not what they would do, but what they needed. And when Zoe hesitated near the edge of the table, her fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair, Adrian moved. First, pulling it out slightly, not with flourish, not with expectation, just enough to make the decision easier. And Zoe looked up at him for a second before sitting down slowly, her movements careful, respectful, as if she understood instinctively that this was not her world, but she was being allowed into it. And Monique followed, taking the seat beside her daughter, her eyes briefly scanning the room again before settling on Adrian, who finally took his place across from them, his posture straight, composed, but not rigid. And for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate, not awkward. And then Zoe reached for a piece of bread, pausing midway, as if asking permission without words, and Adrian gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but enough, and she took it, her small hand steady now, her hunger no longer hidden behind fear. And Monique watched her, something softening in her expression as she saw her daughter relax, even just a little. And then her attention returned to Adrian, her voice quiet but steady. "You said we were safe here," she began, choosing her words carefully. "What does that mean?" And Adrian did not answer immediately, his gaze lowering briefly to the table before returning to her. "It means no one comes here without my permission," he said, his tone even, controlled. And Monique held his gaze, absorbing the weight behind those words, understanding that safety, in his world, was not a suggestion, it was enforced. And she nodded slowly, though the concept still felt foreign, still felt like something that belonged to other people, not to her. And Zoe looked up then, her voice softer, but more certain than before. "Are we going back home?" she asked, the question simple, but shifted something in the room. And Monique's hand tightened slightly around hers, her breath catching just enough to be noticed. And Adrian's eyes moved to Zoe, studying her for a moment, not dismissing the question, not avoiding it. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Not today," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just a decision. And Zoe seemed to accept that, nodding slightly as she looked back down at the table, her focus returning to the food in front of her. But Monique remained still, her thoughts moving faster now, catching up to everything that had happened. And she leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "And tomorrow," she asked, and Adrian's gaze held hers for a second longer this time, something unreadable passing through it before settling back into control. "We will decide that when it comes," he replied. And it was not an answer, not fully, but it was not a dismissal either. And Monique leaned back slowly, her fingers still resting lightly on Zoe's hand, grounding herself again, and the room returned to quiet. But it was different now, not uncertain, not fragile, but steady, as if something had been acknowledged without needing to be fully explained. And across the table, Adrian watched them both, his expression unchanged, but there was something beneath it now, something quieter, something that did not belong to power or control, something that had followed him from the moment a small voice had called out in the rain, and had not yet left. The sunlight shifted gently across the dining room, highlighting the polished wood and casting long, soft shadows that seemed to stretch toward the corners of the space, as if to reassure them that the world outside had not yet intruded. And Adrian remained standing near the end of the table, his posture relaxed but deliberate, a quiet authority radiating from him that demanded no words, yet held everything in check. And Monique adjusted her position slightly, her hands resting lightly on Zoe's small shoulders as she watched her daughter sip from a glass of water, the simplicity of the action grounding them both. And the room seemed to expand around them, not with emptiness, but with a controlled space that invited observation without judgment. And Zoe set her glass down carefully, glancing toward Adrian as if testing the boundaries of this unfamiliar environment, her eyes wide, full of questions she did not yet know how to ask. And Adrian's gaze met hers, calm, steady, without intimidation, as if he could understand the thought forming behind those small eyes without needing it to be spoken. And Monique drew a slow breath, realizing that the tension that had followed them all night was easing in subtle increments, not gone entirely, but shifting, bending towards something new, something that felt like possibility. And she allowed herself to notice small details she had missed before. The way the curtains moved slightly with the breeze, the faint scent of clean linen in the air, the polished floors reflecting just enough light to make the space feel warm rather than imposing, and Adrian's attention never left them. His eyes moving from Zoe to Monique and back again with a quiet consideration, as if weighing their presence in the room, measuring what had just occurred and what might still follow. And then Zoe's voice broke the silence, soft and tentative. "Mama, will it always be like this?" And Monique's hand found her daughter's again, squeezing gently, a silent reassurance that they were together, that some measure of safety existed in this new place. And Adrian's lips curved very slightly, almost imperceptibly, as he responded, "It can be," his voice low and deliberate, a promise without exaggeration, and the words seemed to settle over them like a shield, solid, quiet, yet full of intent, and Monique nodded slowly, understanding that safety here did not come from guarantees, but from presence, from someone who chose to be attentive, observant, and deliberate. And Zoe's eyes moved between the two adults, her small brow furrowed with thought, processing more than she could express, while the room held its quiet, deliberate attention on them, as if every object and shadow was part of the agreement, the unspoken acknowledgement that this moment belonged to them alone. And Adrian stepped forward, moving closer but maintaining a careful distance, his movement measured, intentional, carrying the weight of authority, without intrusion. And Monique noticed the subtle shift in the air, the way the quiet seemed to affirm that he would act if needed, that protection was present even in stillness. And Zoe leaned slightly against her mother, comforted not just by touch, but by the realization that this was a place where someone larger than their immediate world had chosen to notice, to hold space, to observe. And when Adrian's gaze settled on them again, it was steady, unyielding, but not harsh, a silent assurance that for now, at least, they were allowed this small measure of calm, this chance to breathe without anticipation. And Monique exhaled slowly, feeling the tension unravel incrementally, a quiet awareness that the night's chaos had been replaced with a deliberate order. And Zoe closed her eyes briefly, resting, trusting that for this moment, someone was there to ensure the space remained theirs, a pause in the world's uncertainty. And Adrian watched, unmoving, the sentinel of that stillness, as the morning light continued to shift, the shadows stretching gently across the floor, holding them in a moment that was both ordinary and extraordinary, a safe space defined not by walls but by intention. The quiet did not break all at once. It shifted, almost imperceptibly, like something unseen adjusting its weight within the room. And Adrian felt it before anyone else did, his gaze lifting slightly toward the far end of the hallway, where footsteps approached, measured, controlled, not hurried, and a man in a dark suit appeared at the doorway, stopping just short of entering, his posture straight, his voice low and respectful. "Sir." And Adrian did not turn immediately, his attention lingering on Zoe for a fraction of a second longer before he responded with a slight nod, signaling acknowledgement without granting interruption. And the man waited, understanding the unspoken rule of timing, until Adrian finally stepped away from the table, his movements smooth, deliberate, drawing the focus of the room with him as he crossed the space and stopped just within earshot, close enough to hear, far enough to keep the moment contained. And the conversation that followed was quiet, nearly lost beneath the soft sounds of the room. But the shift in Adrian's posture was enough to signal that something beyond these walls still existed, still moved, still required attention. And Monique watched from her seat, her instincts returning not in fear, but in awareness, recognizing the subtle change in the man who had, just hours ago, walked through a door and altered everything. And Zoe noticed it too, her small hands pausing mid-motion, her eyes following Adrian with a quiet curiosity, sensing that whatever he represented did not stop at the boundaries of this house. And after a brief exchange, the man stepped back, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived, leaving Adrian standing still for a moment, his expression unreadable, his thoughts momentarily elsewhere, before he returned to them. The shift in him contained once again beneath calm control, and Monique spoke first this time, her voice steady but observant. "Something is happening," she said, not as a question, but as a recognition, and Adrian met her gaze, not denying it, not softening it. "Something always is," he replied, his tone even, and there was no apology in it, no attempt to make it smaller than it was. And Monique held his gaze, understanding now that whatever safety this place offered did not exist because the world outside had stopped. It existed because he had chosen to hold it back, to control it, and that realization settled into her quietly, reshaping the way she saw him, not just as someone powerful, but as someone who carried the weight of that power constantly. And Zoe looked between them, her brow furrowed slightly as she processed the exchange, and then she spoke, her voice softer than before, but clear. "Are you leaving?" And the question hung in the air for a moment, simple, direct, and Adrian's expression shifted just slightly, something almost human breaking through the surface of control. And he looked at her, not past her, not over her, but directly at her. "Not yet," he said, and the answer was enough. Not because it explained anything, but because it answered what she truly meant. And Zoe nodded slowly, returning her attention to the table, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction, and Monique exhaled quietly, realizing that the presence of this man had become, in a matter of hours, something they were already beginning to rely on, something that filled the space in a way she had never allowed before. And Adrian resumed his place at the table, his posture unchanged, but the silence that followed carried a different weight now, not just calm, but awareness, a reminder that beyond these walls, the world had not stopped. It had simply been held at a distance, and for the first time, Monique understood that safety here was not permanent. It was chosen, maintained, and that the man sitting across from her was the one holding that choice in place. And as the morning light continued to move across the room, stretching slowly toward the far corners, the stillness remained, but beneath it, something else existed now, something unspoken but undeniable, the understanding that this moment, this calm, had been created and could just as easily be taken away, and yet for now it held, steady, controlled, and real. The stillness at the table did not break, but it deepened, settling into something more defined, something that carried awareness beneath its calm surface. And Adrian remained seated, his posture unchanged, yet his attention had shifted again, not outward this time, but inward, as if measuring something he had not planned. For something that had entered his world without permission and refused to leave quietly. And across from him, Monique studied him more carefully now, no longer just observing his actions, but trying to understand the space between them, the silence he carried, the restraint he chose, and she realized that nothing about him was accidental, not the way he spoke, not the way he moved, not even the moments when he chose not to act. And that realization unsettled her in a different way, because it meant everything had purpose, even this, even them. And Zoe shifted slightly in her chair, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate absent-mindedly as she looked between them again, her voice soft but thoughtful. "Do you live here alone?" And the question landed differently than the others, simple on the surface, but it reached somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, and Adrian's gaze moved to her, holding for just a moment longer than before, as if deciding how much truth belonged in the answer. And then he said, most of the time, his voice calm, but there was something behind it now, something that did not quite match the stillness he carried. And Zoe nodded slowly, accepting the answer without pressing further. But Monique noticed the shift, subtle but present, and she leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she had seen it. "That sounds like a choice," she said quietly, and Adrian's expression did not change. But the silence that followed was different, heavier, as if the question had reached a place he did not often allow others to see. And for a moment, he did not respond, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the light had shifted again, brighter now, more defined before returning to her. "It is," he said simply, and Monique held his gaze, understanding that behind that single word was something far more complex, something built over time, something chosen again and again, and she nodded slowly, not pushing further, because she recognized the boundary without needing it to be spoken. And Zoe looked at him again, her curiosity unfiltered, her voice softer now, almost careful. Do you get lonely? And the room went still in a different way. Not tense, not uncertain, but aware, as if even the walls were listening for the answer. And Adrian did not look away this time, his eyes remaining on her, steady, calm. But there was a pause, longer than any before, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all morning. Not often, he said, and it was the kind of answer that did not deny the truth, but did not fully reveal it either. And Zoe seemed to accept it, her small nod carrying a kind of understanding that did not require explanation, and Monique exhaled slowly, something shifting in her perception, because she realized that this man, this figure of control and certainty, carried something else beneath it, something that did not fit the image she had built, something human, something guarded. And the silence that followed was no longer just calm, it was shared, a space where nothing needed to be forced. And Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze moving between them once more, not assessing, not controlling, just present. And for the first time since they had entered his world, the distance between them felt smaller, not because anything had been explained, but because something had been acknowledged quietly, without demand. And as the morning light filled the room completely now, leaving no shadows untouched, the moment settled into something steady, something real, a pause between what had happened and what would come next, held together not by certainty, but by choice. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt deliberate, as if something invisible had settled between them, something that did not need to be named to be understood. And Adrian remained still for a moment longer before he shifted slightly in his seat, his attention returning fully to the present, to the two people sitting across from him who had somehow stepped into his world without asking permission and yet had not been turned away. And Monique watched him carefully, her instincts no longer warning her to retreat, but urging her to understand, to see beyond what was visible, because nothing about this situation followed the rules she had lived by, and that alone meant it required a different kind of awareness. And she leaned forward just slightly, her voice calm but grounded in something deeper now. You said we are safe here, she repeated, not questioning the truth of it, but testing the meaning again. And Adrian met her gaze without hesitation, his expression steady. You are, he said, and there was no change in his tone, no need to reinforce it, because the certainty was already there. And Monique nodded slowly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. Then why us? She asked. And this time the question did not come from confusion, but from something more direct, something that wanted clarity. And Adrian did not look away. But there was a pause, subtle, controlled, as if the answer was not difficult, but precise, and he chose it carefully. Because she asked, he said, his eyes shifting briefly toward Zoe, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than anything more complicated could have. And Zoe looked up at him, her expression soft, her voice quiet. You listened, she said, not as a question, but as a realization. And Adrian held her gaze for a moment before giving a small nod, and something in that exchange shifted the room again, not in tension, but in understanding, because for Zoe it was simple. She had called, and he had answered. But for Monique, it meant something else entirely. It meant that in a world where people chose not to see, not to hear, someone had chosen differently, and that choice had changed everything. And she exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction more, the weight she had carried for so long beginning to shift in ways she could not yet fully process. And Adrian leaned back slightly, his posture unchanged, but his presence quieter now, less guarded, as if the space between them no longer required distance. And the morning light continued to fill the room, steady and warm, erasing the last of the shadows. And for a moment, nothing else intruded, not the world outside, not the responsibilities that waited beyond these walls, just this stillness, this pause. And then Adrian stood, his movements smooth, controlled, drawing their attention without demanding it. And Monique looked up, a flicker of uncertainty returning. But not fear, not anymore, just awareness that something was. Shifting again, and Adrian's gaze moved between them, steady, deliberate. "You will stay here for now," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a continuation of what had already begun, and Monique nodded slowly, understanding that this was not about control, but about protection, and Zoe looked up at him again, her voice soft but certain. "Will you come back?" And Adrian paused. For just a fraction of a second, the question landing somewhere deeper than the others had, and when he answered, his voice was quiet, but unwavering yes, and it was not a promise made lightly, not a word given without intention, and Zoe seemed to accept it immediately, nodding as if that was all she needed, and Adrian turned slightly, his attention shifting toward the hallway, toward whatever waited beyond this moment. But before he moved, his gaze returned to them one last time, steady, composed, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not belong to power or obligation, but to something simpler, something human. And then he walked away, his footsteps quiet, measured, leaving behind a space that no longer felt uncertain, but held, protected. And as Monique watched him go, she realized that for the first time in a long time, she was not waiting for something to go wrong. She was simply waiting, and that alone felt like something new. The house did not return to silence after Adrian left. It transformed, settling into a quieter rhythm that felt less like waiting and more like being held in place, as if his absence did not remove the protection, but simply changed its shape. And Monique remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes resting on the doorway where he had disappeared, her thoughts moving slowly now, no longer racing ahead to anticipate the next problem, but circling back, replaying everything that had happened, trying to understand how a single moment, a single decision had shifted the direction of her life so completely. And beside her, Zoe swung her feet gently under the chair, the tension in her small body gone, replaced by something lighter, something closer to what a child should feel in the morning. And she looked up at her mother, her voice soft but curious. "Mama, do you think he really meant it?" And Monique blinked, her attention returning to the present, to the question that mattered more than anything else. And she studied her daughter's face for a moment, seeing the trust there, the quiet belief that had not been broken despite everything they had been through. And she reached out, brushing her fingers gently along Zoe's cheek. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, more certain than she expected it to be. "I think he did." And Zoe nodded slowly, accepting the answer without hesitation, as if that was all she needed. And she slid down from her chair, her small feet touching the floor with a soft sound as she looked around the room again, this time with less caution, more curiosity. And Monique watched her, something in her chest loosening further, a quiet realization settling in that this place, for now, allowed her daughter to be a child again, even if only for a little while. And that alone was something she could not ignore, and she stood slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she were testing the ground beneath her, making sure it would hold. And as she walked toward the large window, the light catching her face, she paused, looking out at the world beyond the gates, the city still moving, still loud, still unpredictable, and yet it felt distant now, separated by more than just walls, separated by a decision that had placed them here. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider something she had not in years, what it might feel like to not just survive, but to choose, and the thought unsettled her. Not because it was impossible, but because it was unfamiliar, and behind her, footsteps approached softly, one of the staff members entering with quiet efficiency, carrying a tray, setting it down without interruption, as if they understood that this space belonged to Monique and Zoe now, at least for this moment. And Monique turned slightly, offering a small nod of acknowledgement, still adjusting to being treated with a kind of respect that did not require explanation, and the woman returned the nod before stepping away again, leaving the room as quietly as she had entered, and Zoe wandered closer to the window, standing beside her mother, her eyes scanning the view. "It is different here," she said softly, and Monique looked down at her, then back out at the city, and she nodded. "Yes," she replied, her voice thoughtful. "It is," and they stood there together for a moment, not speaking, just sharing the quiet, And in that stillness, something began to take shape. Not a plan, not a certainty, but a possibility, fragile but real. And Monique realized that whatever came next, whatever decisions had to be made, they would not be the same ones she had made before, because now she knew something. She had not known then that sometimes someone did listen, sometimes someone did step in, and sometimes the world did change direction, even if only for a moment. And as the light continued to pour into the room, filling every corner, she felt it clearly for the first time. Not fear, not doubt, but something quieter, something steadier, the beginning of trust. Not in the world, not yet, but in the possibility that it could be different. The day moved forward slowly, not because time had changed, but because for the first time in a long while, Monique was not racing against it, and the quiet of the house remained steady, unbroken, as if it had decided to protect this moment for as long as it could. And Zoe sat by the window now, her small fingers tracing invisible shapes against the glass, her reflection faint but present, her expression thoughtful in a way that did not belong to someone her age, yet softened by the calm she had been given. And Monique stood a few steps behind her, watching, her arms loosely crossed, not in defense, but in reflection, her mind no longer trapped in survival, but moving through something new, something uncertain yet not frightening. And as the hours passed, the house remained consistent, meals appearing without disruption, doors opening and closing without noise, people moving with quiet respect, never intruding, never questioning. And it was in that consistency that Monique began to understand the true nature of what Adrian had created. Not just control, not just power, but order, a kind of order that removed chaos without needing to announce it. And it changed something inside her, something she had built over years of enduring unpredictability, and now found herself slowly, cautiously allowing to loosen. And as the afternoon lights softened into a warmer glow, footsteps returned to the hallway, measured, familiar, and Zoe turned before the sound fully reached them, her eyes lighting up with a recognition that needed no confirmation. And when Adrian stepped into the room again, nothing about him had changed, his posture still composed, his expression still controlled, but the space itself responded, as if acknowledging the return of something essential. And Zoe moved first, not running, not rushing, but walking toward him with a quiet certainty, stopping just a few feet away, her voice soft but steady. "You came back." And Adrian looked down at her, his gaze steady, and for the first time, there was no pause before his answer. "I said I would," he replied, and it was not pride, not emphasis, just truth. And Zoe nodded, satisfied, as if that was all that mattered. And Monique stepped forward more slowly, her eyes meeting his, searching again, but this time not for answers, but for confirmation of something she had already begun to believe. And Adrian met her gaze without resistance, without distance, and in that moment, nothing needed to be explained because everything that mattered had already been shown, and the silence between them held something different now. Not uncertainty, not caution, but recognition. And Monique exhaled quietly, a small shift, but a meaningful one, as if she had finally allowed herself to accept what had happened. And Adrian glanced briefly around the room, his attention taking in the details, the absence of tension, the presence of calm, and he gave a slight nod, almost to himself, before looking back at them, and though he did not say it, it was understood. This was not temporary, not just a pause in the storm. It was a decision, one that extended beyond a single night, beyond a single act. And as the light from the window stretched across the floor, catching the edges of the room in a soft glow, Zoe stepped closer to her mother again, her hands slipping into hers naturally. And Monique did not pull away, did not hesitate, because she understood now that holding on did not mean holding back. And Adrian stood before them, not as a stranger anymore, not as a force of interruption, but as something else entirely, something quieter, something steadier, a presence that had chosen to see, to listen, and to act. And in that stillness, the world outside felt distant once more, not erased, not forgotten, but held at bay. And as the room settled into its calm, No words were needed to define what had changed, because it was already there in the way Zoe stood. Without fear, in the way Monique breathed without tension, and in the way Adrian remained. Not because he had to, but because he chose to, and that choice, simple and absolute, was what remained when everything else faded into silence.